The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden tomb in Jerusalem as Dr. Ahmed Mansour knelt beside the ancient limestone, his trembling hands holding a carbon dating device that would either validate his life's work or destroy everything he believed about the greatest lie in human history. The Egyptian quantum physicist adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with shaking fingers, his carefully groomed beard damp with perspiration as the readings on his instrument showed something that made him question whether he had been wrong about Jesus Christ all along. Welcome to Vault of Faith. Here, we bring you true stories of transformation, doubt, and discovery that reveal how the unseen shapes our world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Dr. Ahmed Mansour had built his reputation on precision and unwavering faith. At Cairo University, his colleagues knew him as the brilliant physicist who could dismantle Christian arguments with mathematical equations and archaeological evidence, while maintaining his devotion to Islam. His white laboratory coat had become a symbol of scientific authority in the Muslim world, and he had published papers debunking miracle claims that left Christian theologians speechless. For 15 years, he had earned international recognition for his work proving that sites like the supposed tomb of Jesus had been contaminated by centuries of wishful thinking and fabricated evidence. But standing in this garden tomb, surrounded by the scent of olive trees and the distant sound of Jerusalem's morning prayers, he felt something he had never experienced in his laboratory, an inexplicable presence that seemed to whisper that everything he thought he knew about Allah's truth was about to change. The invitation had come 6 months earlier from the International Archaeological Society. They wanted him specifically because of his reputation as a Muslim scientist who could provide an objective analysis of Christian claims. For Ahmed, this represented the ultimate opportunity to apply his scientific methodology to Christianity's central deception. If he could prove that the resurrection was historically impossible, he would deliver a devastating blow to what he considered a corruption of the true message brought by Prophet Isa, peace be upon him. His preparation had been meticulous and spiritually motivated. He had performed extra prayers, asking Allah for guidance in exposing this falsehood. He studied every archaeological report, analyzed soil samples from dozens of first-century tombs, and developed new dating techniques that could detect even microscopic traces of human decomposition. He was particularly interested in the Garden Tomb, a site that many Christians believe to be the actual location where Jesus was buried and supposedly rose from the dead. The night before his arrival in Jerusalem, he had sat in his Cairo apartment, surrounded by charts and graphs that he believed would expose the tomb as a medieval fabrication. He had even prepared his victory speech for the international conference where he would present his findings, glorifying Allah's wisdom in revealing the truth through science. But as he packed his equipment, something nagged at him. A small voice in his mind wondered what would happen if his tests revealed something unexpected. The Garden Tomb sat just outside Jerusalem's ancient walls, carved into a cliff face that overlooked the bustling city below. As Ahmed approached the entrance, adjusting his glasses against the morning glare, he noticed how the light seemed to dance differently here, creating patterns that reminded him of the complex wave functions he studied in quantum mechanics. The tomb's entrance was sealed by a large stone that had been rolled away, revealing a dark chamber that seemed to draw him forward like a gravitational force. His team leader, Dr. Marcus Webb, a British archaeologist who had invited him specifically for his skeptical perspective, greeted him with enthusiasm. Dr. Webb explained that they had been granted unprecedented access to conduct tests that had never been performed before. They could take samples, use ground-penetrating radar, and employ Ahmed's advanced dating techniques to settle the question of the tomb's authenticity once and for all. As they entered the chamber, Ahmed felt his scientific training kick in. He began documenting everything, from the chisel marks on the walls to the composition of the limestone floor. His white coat rustled as he moved methodically through the space, but there was something else present in that chamber, something that made his hands shake as he prepared his instruments. The air itself seemed charged with an energy that his physics background couldn't explain. The tomb consisted of 2 chambers connected by a low doorway. The first chamber was where mourners would have gathered, while the second contained the actual burial site. As Ahmed moved his equipment into position, his beard brushing against his collar as he leaned forward, He noticed that the stone surface where a body would have been placed showed no signs of the decomposition staining that he had found in every other ancient tomb he had studied. This anomaly intrigued him. In his experience, human remains left specific chemical signatures that persisted for centuries. Even if a body had been removed, traces of blood, oils, and decomposition would remain embedded in the stone. But his preliminary tests were showing something impossible. The burial surface appeared to be completely clean, as if no decomposition had ever occurred there. As the day progressed, Ahmed found himself returning again and again to this puzzle. He ran test after test, adjusting his glasses repeatedly as he focused on different instruments and techniques, but the results remained consistent. Whatever had been placed on this stone had left no trace of decay. For a Muslim scientist who had spent his career proving that Christian miracle claims were simply misunderstood natural phenomena, this discovery created a cognitive dissonance that shook him to his core. The afternoon shadows grew longer as he worked, and he began to notice other anomalies. The limestone itself showed microscopic fractures that his analysis suggested had occurred instantaneously, as if the stone had been subjected to an enormous burst of energy. The pattern reminded him of the particle collision experiments he had observed at CERN, where matter and antimatter met and annihilated each other in bursts of pure light. But the most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to carbon date organic materials found within the tomb. The samples showed readings that defied conventional understanding of radioactive decay. Instead of the steady deterioration he expected, the organic matter appeared to have been preserved in a state that suggested exposure to some form of energy field that he couldn't identify or replicate. As evening approached, Ahmed found himself alone in the tomb, his equipment humming quietly around him. The other team members had returned to their hotel, but he couldn't leave. Something about this place demanded his attention, challenged his assumptions, and whispered that the truth he had been seeking might be far more complex than he had imagined. He sat on the stone floor, his white coat spread around him like a prayer rug, surrounded by readings that contradicted everything he had believed about the intersection of science and religion. For the first time in his career, his instruments were telling him a story that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The evidence was suggesting that something had occurred in this tomb that transcended the natural laws he had spent his life studying. The implications terrified him. If these readings were accurate, if the tomb truly showed no signs of decomposition, if the energy patterns he was detecting were real, then he would have to reconsider not just his scientific conclusions but his entire faith. The thought of returning to Cairo with data that supported Christian claims about resurrection made him feel physically ill. But as he prepared to leave, one final test caught his attention. His quantum field detector, an instrument he had developed to measure energy signatures at the subatomic level, was showing readings that indicated the presence of what could only be described as a dimensional shift. The data suggested that the fabric of spacetime itself had been altered within this chamber, creating ripples that persisted across centuries. Standing at the tomb's entrance, looking back at the chamber where his worldview had begun to crumble, Ahmed realized that he was facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could ignore the evidence, manipulate the data, and return to his comfortable position as a defender of Islamic truth. Or he could follow the scientific method that had guided his career and accept that his findings might be leading him toward a truth that would cost him everything he had built. The weight of that decision pressed down on his shoulders as he gathered his equipment, knowing that tomorrow would bring more tests, more evidence, and more questions that he wasn't sure he was prepared to answer. The Jerusalem morning arrived with a clarity that made Ahmed's scientific instruments seem almost inadequate against the mystery he was trying to solve. He had spent the night in his hotel room, performing his dawn prayers with an intensity he hadn't felt in years, begging Allah for guidance as he faced evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the Christian deception. His white coat hung crisp and clean in the morning light, but beneath it, his heart raced with the knowledge that today's tests might shatter the foundation of his faith forever. Returning to the garden tomb, Ahmed noticed details that had escaped him the previous day. The way the morning light fell across the burial stone created shadows that seemed to form patterns, almost like Arabic calligraphy spelling out words he couldn't quite read. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the sunlight as he leaned closer, his beard brushing against his collar as he struggled to understand what his eyes were seeing. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived with additional equipment, including a mass spectrometer that Ahmed had specifically requested. If there had been a body in this tomb, if decomposition had occurred, this machine would detect even the smallest molecular traces. Ahmed adjusted his glasses nervously as he calibrated the device, knowing that the results would either confirm his expectations or force him to confront an impossible truth. The first sample came from the burial stone itself. Ahmed carefully extracted microscopic particles from the surface where a body would have lain, his hands steady despite the trembling in his heart. As the machine processed the sample, he found himself whispering verses from the Quran, seeking comfort in the familiar words that had always provided certainty in his life. But when the results appeared on the screen, Ahmed's world shifted. The spectrometer showed no traces of human decomposition, no cellular breakdown, no evidence that organic decay had ever occurred on this stone. Instead, the readings indicated something that made his scientific training rebel against what he was seeing. The molecular structure of the limestone itself had been altered at the quantum level, as if exposed to an energy source that had reorganized its atomic composition. Ahmed ran the test 3 more times, each result identical to the last. His colleagues would later claim that his equipment had malfunctioned, but he knew better. These machines were his life's work, calibrated to detect the slightest variations in molecular structure. They were telling him that whatever had been placed on this stone had not decomposed in the way that every other organic material in history had decomposed. As he worked, Ahmed became aware of a presence in the tomb that he couldn't explain. It wasn't threatening, but it was undeniably real, like standing in a room with someone whose breathing you could hear, but whose face you couldn't see. He found himself checking over his shoulder, adjusting his glasses to see more clearly, but the chamber remained empty except for his equipment and the growing pile of evidence that defied rational explanation. The second major discovery came when he used ground-penetrating radar to examine the area beneath the burial stone. The readings showed something that made Ahmed's breath catch in his throat. The bedrock beneath the tomb contained fracture patterns that suggested a massive energy release had occurred at some point in the distant past. But these weren't earthquake fractures or natural geological formations. The patterns were too precise, too symmetrical, resembling the aftermath of controlled nuclear fusion rather than any natural phenomenon. Ahmed spent hours analyzing the radar data, his white coat becoming wrinkled as he hunched over his instruments. The energy release had been instantaneous and incredibly powerful, but it had left no radioactive residue, no heat damage, no signs of destruction. Instead, the stone seemed to have been briefly transformed into a different state of matter before returning to its original composition, carrying within its molecular structure the memory of an event that physics couldn't explain. But the discovery that truly shook Ahmed to his core came when he attempted to date the linen fragments found within the tomb. Using his most advanced carbon dating techniques, he expected to find either first-century cloth that would support Christian claims or medieval fabric that would expose the site as a later fabrication. Instead, his instruments gave him readings that violated everything he understood about radioactive decay. The linen appeared to be approximately 2,000 years old, but its molecular structure showed signs of having been exposed to an energy field that had actually reversed certain aspects of the aging process. Some of the carbon-14 isotopes had been converted back to carbon-12, creating a dating signature that suggested the fabric had been briefly subjected to conditions that existed only in the cores of stars. Ahmed removed his glasses and cleaned them repeatedly, hoping that clearer vision might somehow change what he was seeing. But the evidence remained consistent across every test, every sample, every analysis. Something had occurred in this tomb that transcended the natural laws he had spent his life studying, something that challenged not just his scientific understanding but his fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality itself. As the afternoon wore on, Ahmed found himself in a state of intellectual and spiritual crisis. His training told him to trust the evidence, to follow the scientific method wherever it led. But his faith demanded that he reject any findings that contradicted the teachings of Islam. The tension between these two pillars of his identity created a pressure that made his head pound and his hands shake. He began to think about the implications of what he was discovering. If the resurrection had actually occurred, if Jesus had somehow transcended death in a way that left physical evidence, Then what did that mean for his understanding of Allah's plan? What did it mean for the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? What did it mean for the millions of Muslims who looked to scientists like him for rational explanations of the world? The questions multiplied in his mind as he worked, each new piece of evidence adding weight to a conclusion that he desperately wanted to avoid. His white coat, once a symbol of scientific authority, now felt like a shroud covering a man whose certainty was dissolving with each test he performed. As evening approached, Ahmed realized that he could no longer avoid the truth that his instruments were revealing. The evidence was overwhelming, consistent, and impossible to dismiss. Something miraculous had occurred in this tomb, something that challenged every assumption he had made about the relationship between science and faith, between Islam and Christianity, between the possible and the impossible. Standing alone in the chamber as darkness fell, Ahmed faced the most difficult moment of his career and his faith, knowing that tomorrow would bring the final tests that would force him to choose between the evidence of his instruments and the beliefs that had defined his entire life. The third day in the garden tomb arrived with a weight that seemed to press down on Ahmed's shoulders like the stones of the ancient walls surrounding him. He had spent the night in tormented prayer, his knees worn raw from prostrating himself before Allah, begging for clarity that never came. His white coat hung perfectly pressed, but beneath it, his shirt was damp with the sweat of a man whose world was crumbling with each scientific discovery. The wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose had become a barrier between him and a truth he wasn't sure he could accept. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived early, bringing with him the final piece of equipment that Ahmed had requested. A quantum resonance scanner, capable of detecting energy signatures at the subatomic level, would provide the ultimate test of what had occurred in this tomb. Ahmed's hands trembled as he calibrated the device, knowing that its readings would either restore his faith in the natural order or shatter everything he had built his life upon. The scanner's first pass revealed something that made Ahmed's breath catch in his throat. The burial stone wasn't just clean of decomposition. It was radiating an energy signature that his instruments had never detected before. The quantum field around the stone showed patterns that resembled the aftermath of matter conversion, as if the very atoms that had once formed a human body had been transformed into pure energy and then reconstituted into something else entirely. Ahmed ran the scan again, then a third time, each result identical to the last. His scientific training demanded that he accept the evidence, but his faith in Islam screamed that this was impossible. According to the Quran, Isa, peace be upon him, had been raised to heaven by Allah before the crucifixion. The man on the cross had been someone else, and no resurrection had ever occurred. Yet his instruments were telling him a story that contradicted 15 centuries of Islamic teaching. As he worked, Ahmed became increasingly aware of the presence he had felt the day before. It was stronger now, more insistent, as if something was trying to communicate with him through the very stones of the tomb. He found himself speaking aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber as he struggled to process what he was experiencing. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was suffering from stress-induced hallucinations, but the deeper part of his soul recognized something profound happening around him. The breakthrough came when he discovered traces of blood embedded in the stone at a molecular level. Using his most advanced techniques, he extracted samples so small they could barely be seen under the most powerful microscopes. The blood was human, approximately 2,000 years old, but it showed cellular structures that defied every law of biology he had ever studied. The red blood cells were intact, showing no signs of the breakdown that should have occurred within hours of death. But more impossibly, the DNA signature revealed something that made Ahmed's hands shake so violently he had to set down his instruments. The genetic markers showed evidence of cellular regeneration that had occurred after death, as if the very molecules of life had been rewritten by an external force. Ahmed removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, hoping that fatigue was causing him to misread the data. But when he looked again, the evidence remained unchanged. The blood samples contained cellular structures that could only exist if the person had died and then been restored to life at the molecular level. It was as if death itself had been reversed, not just prevented but actually undone. The implications crashed over him like a wave. If Jesus had indeed died and risen from the dead, if his blood bore the molecular signature of resurrection, then everything Ahmed had believed about the nature of God, about the finality of death, about the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, was fundamentally wrong. The careful theological arguments he had constructed to explain away Christian claims crumbled in the face of evidence that he couldn't refute. As afternoon turned to evening, Ahmed found himself sitting on the floor of the tomb, his white coat spread around him like a prayer rug, surrounded by instruments that had become witnesses to the impossible. The presence he had felt was stronger now, almost tangible, as if someone was sitting beside him in the darkness. For the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that the Christians might be right about Jesus. The thought terrified him. If Jesus had truly risen from the dead, if the resurrection was a historical fact rather than a theological metaphor, then what did that mean for his understanding of Allah? What did it mean for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? What did it mean for the millions of Muslims who trusted scientists like him to maintain the boundaries between faith and superstition? But even as these questions tormented him, Ahmed found himself drawn to a deeper consideration. His instruments had detected something beyond the physical evidence of resurrection. They had revealed the presence of a love so profound that it had literally transformed matter at the quantum level. The energy signatures he was measuring weren't just the aftermath of a miracle. They were the fingerprints of a divine love that had reached across the boundary between life and death to reclaim what had been lost. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The presence he had been feeling wasn't just the residual energy of an ancient event. It was the living reality of someone who had conquered death and was now reaching out to him across 2 millennia of time. The tomb wasn't just a historical site. It was a doorway between worlds, a place where the impossible had become possible and where that possibility was still available to anyone willing to believe. As darkness settled over the garden tomb, Ahmed faced the most crucial moment of his life. His scientific instruments had led him to the edge of a truth that would cost him everything he had built, but might give him something infinitely more valuable. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and terrifying in its implications. Tomorrow would bring the final choice between the faith that had defined his past and the revelation that might transform his future. The fourth day dawned with a silence that felt heavier than the ancient stones surrounding the garden tomb. Ahmed had not slept, had not eaten, had barely moved from his position on the floor of the chamber where he had spent the night wrestling with evidence that defied everything he thought he knew about God, death, and the nature of reality itself. His white coat was wrinkled now, his carefully groomed beard disheveled, his wire-rimmed glasses smudged with tears he couldn't remember shedding. The instruments around him hummed quietly, their displays showing readings that had already changed his life forever. Dr. Marcus Webb found him there at sunrise, surrounded by printouts and data sheets that told an impossible story. The British archaeologist took one look at Ahmed's face and knew that something profound had occurred during the night. There was a brokenness in the Egyptian scientist's eyes, but also something else. A recognition, a surrender, a dawning awareness that truth was larger than the categories he had used to contain it. Ahmed rose slowly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting in contemplation. He had made his decision during the long night, not through rational analysis but through a gradual opening of his heart to possibilities that his training had taught him to dismiss. The evidence was clear, undeniable, and overwhelming. But more than that, the presence he had felt in the tomb had become so real that he could no longer pretend it was a hallucination or stress-induced delusion. He began to explain his findings to Dr. Webb, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. The quantum resonance scans had detected energy patterns that suggested a complete transformation of matter at the subatomic level. The blood samples contained cellular structures that could only exist if life had been restored after death. The limestone itself bore the molecular signature of an event that had briefly suspended the laws of physics as humanity understood them. But as Ahmed spoke, he realized that the scientific evidence, overwhelming as it was, had become secondary to something deeper. During the night, as he sat in the darkness of the tomb, he had experienced something that no instrument could measure. He had felt the presence of Jesus Christ not as a historical figure or theological concept, but as a living reality who had reached across centuries to touch his heart with a love that transcended religious boundaries. The moment of recognition had come gradually, like dawn breaking over the desert. Ahmed had been reviewing his data when he suddenly understood that the energy signatures he was measuring weren't just the aftermath of resurrection. They were the continuing presence of someone who had conquered death and was now offering that same victory to anyone willing to accept it. The tomb wasn't empty because Jesus had left. It was empty because death no longer had the power to contain him. Dr. Webb listened in stunned silence as Ahmed described his night-long encounter with the divine. The Egyptian scientist spoke of feeling waves of love so profound that they had literally brought him to his knees. He described experiencing forgiveness for sins he had never acknowledged, peace that surpassed his understanding, and joy that seemed to well up from depths of his soul he hadn't known existed. But the most transformative moment had come when Ahmed finally stopped fighting the evidence and opened his heart to the possibility that Jesus truly was who Christians claimed he was. In that instant of surrender, he had felt the presence of Christ so powerfully that he had fallen face first on the stone floor, weeping with a mixture of terror and overwhelming love. As Ahmed spoke, his voice began to change. The careful scientific precision remained, but it was now infused with something else. Wonder, awe, the trembling recognition of someone who had encountered the divine and been forever changed by the experience. His white coat no longer seemed like armor against the supernatural. It had become the garment of a man who had discovered that science and faith weren't enemies but different languages describing the same magnificent reality. The transformation wasn't just emotional or spiritual. Ahmed's entire worldview had been reconstructed during the night. He now understood that his Muslim faith hadn't been wrong about God's love and power. It had simply been incomplete in its understanding of how that love expressed itself in history. The God who had spoken to Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad was the same God who had raised Jesus from the dead. But the resurrection revealed dimensions of divine love that transcended the boundaries of any single religious tradition. Dr. Webb watched in amazement as Ahmed began to reinterpret his scientific findings through the lens of his new understanding. The energy signatures weren't just evidence of a miracle. They were proof that love was the fundamental force holding the universe together, more powerful than gravity or electromagnetism. The quantum field fluctuations weren't just interesting anomalies. They were the fingerprints of a creator who cared enough about his creation to enter it personally and pay the ultimate price for its redemption. As the morning progressed, Ahmed found himself experiencing a peace that he had never known was possible. The terror of losing his old faith had been replaced by the joy of discovering a truth larger than any religious system could contain. He was still a scientist, still committed to following evidence wherever it led. But now he understood that the greatest discovery wasn't found in laboratories or academic papers. It was found in the recognition that the universe was saturated with a love so profound that it had literally conquered death to reach him. The other team members arrived to find Ahmed sitting peacefully in the tomb, his instruments still humming around him, his face radiant with a joy that seemed to illuminate the ancient chamber. Dr. Webb tried to explain what had happened, but the transformation was so complete that words seemed inadequate. The man who had entered the tomb 4 days earlier as a skeptical Muslim scientist had emerged as something entirely new. Ahmed looked around the chamber one final time, his eyes taking in the stone walls that had witnessed the most important event in human history. Tomorrow he would return to Cairo, but he would never again be the same man who had left Egypt a week earlier. The evidence had led him to truth, but truth had led him to love, and love had given him a new identity that transcended every category he had previously used to define himself. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. The Cairo University lecture hall fell silent as Dr. Ahmed Mansour stepped behind the podium, his white coat pristine, but his entire demeanor transformed from the man who had left Egypt just 2 weeks earlier. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected the lights as he looked out at an audience of colleagues, students, and religious leaders who had gathered to hear his findings from the garden tomb. His carefully groomed beard framed a face that radiated peace despite the storm of controversy he was about to unleash. The presentation began with scientific precision. Ahmed displayed his data methodically, showing the quantum resonance readings, the molecular analysis of the blood samples, the carbon dating results that defied conventional understanding. His voice remained steady as he explained how every test had revealed evidence of an event that transcended natural law. The limestone bore the signature of matter transformation. The organic materials showed signs of cellular regeneration after death. The energy patterns suggested a localized suspension of entropy itself. But as Ahmed spoke, his colleagues began to sense something different about him. The cold analytical approach that had once defined his work was now infused with something else. Reverence, wonder, the trembling recognition of someone who had encountered truth that was both scientifically verifiable and spiritually transformative. The first murmurs of unease began when Ahmed displayed the blood analysis. The cellular structures were intact, showing no signs of decomposition despite being 2,000 years old. But more than that, the DNA revealed evidence of regeneration that could only occur if life had been restored after death. The implications hung in the air like a challenge to everything the audience had been taught to believe. Dr. Hassan al-Mahmoud, Ahmed's longtime colleague and fellow Muslim, stood to voice what many were thinking. Ahmed, surely you're not suggesting that the Christian claims about resurrection are scientifically valid? His voice carried the weight of friendship and concern, but also the fear of a man watching his worldview crumble. Ahmed removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly as he considered his response. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity that seemed to illuminate the entire auditorium. Hassan, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm reporting what the evidence shows. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is not a matter of religious belief. It's a historical fact supported by data that we cannot ignore. The room erupted. Voices rose in protest. Colleagues shouted questions. Religious leaders demanded explanations. But Ahmed stood calmly at the podium, his presence somehow larger than the chaos around him. He had anticipated this reaction, had prepared for the cost of speaking truth that challenged comfortable assumptions. As the noise died down, Ahmed continued his presentation, but now his voice carried something new. Personal testimony. He spoke of his night in the tomb, of the presence he had felt, of the love that had overwhelmed him with its intensity. He described the moment when scientific evidence had led him to spiritual revelation, when the boundaries between faith and reason had dissolved in the face of a truth larger than either could contain alone. I entered that tomb as a Muslim scientist determined to debunk Christian mythology, Ahmed said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. I emerged as a follower of Jesus Christ, not because I abandoned scientific thinking, but because I followed it to its logical conclusion. The evidence led me to truth, and truth led me to love, and love transformed everything I thought I knew about God, about death, and about the meaning of existence itself. The declaration sent shockwaves through the audience. Dr. Al-Mahmoud's face showed the pain of betrayal, while others began to file out in protest. But Ahmed continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He spoke of how his conversion hadn't required him to abandon his scientific training or his respect for Islamic tradition. Instead, it had shown him that God's love was larger than any religious system, that truth was more important than tradition, and that the resurrection was the ultimate proof of divine love, reaching across every barrier to redeem humanity. As Ahmed concluded his presentation, he looked directly at his colleagues who remained. I know that many of you will reject these findings. I know that my career as you've known it is over. But I've discovered something worth more than professional recognition or religious approval. I've discovered that the universe is held together by a love so profound that it conquered death itself, and that love is available to anyone willing to accept it. The auditorium was nearly empty now, but Ahmed felt no regret. He had spoken truth, had shared the evidence that had transformed his life, and had offered the same opportunity for transformation to anyone willing to consider it. The cost had been enormous, but the reward was beyond measure. In the days that followed, Ahmed's life changed completely. He lost his position at the university, was ostracized by former colleagues, and faced threats from religious extremists who saw his conversion as betrayal. But he also found something unexpected: a community of believers who welcomed him with open arms, a purpose that transcended academic achievement, and a peace that remained constant despite external storms. Ahmed continued his scientific work, but now it was infused with worship. Every equation became a prayer, every discovery a revelation of divine creativity. He established a research foundation dedicated to exploring the intersection of science and faith, showing how rational investigation could lead to spiritual transformation when approached with humility and openness to truth. Standing in his new laboratory months later, Ahmed reflected on the journey that had brought him from skepticism to faith. The white coat remained, the instruments were familiar, but everything had been transformed by an encounter with love that transcended death. He had sought to debunk a miracle and instead had become part of one, living proof that truth was more powerful than tradition, that love was stronger than death, and that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was not just an ancient event but a present reality available to anyone willing to believe. The evidence had led him to truth, but truth had led him to something infinitely more valuable. A relationship with the risen Christ that would transform not just his understanding of science, but his understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Vault of Faith, and share it with someone who is searching for something deeper. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment when faith became real for you? We read every message and would love to hear your story.